At the far northern edge of the Antarctic Peninsula, where the Southern Ocean narrows into shifting corridors of ice and wind, a small, mountainous landmass rises abruptly from the sea. Elephant Island is not part of any continent in the familiar sense. It exists apart, isolated, exposed, and largely untouched by human presence. Its beaches are narrow and uneven, formed from coarse shingle and broken stone. Behind them, steep slopes climb quickly into ridges covered in permanent ice and snow. For most of the year, the island is surrounded by pack ice or heavy seas. Waves from the Drake Passage move with little interruption across thousands of kilometers, striking the shoreline with consistent force. There are no natural harbors, no sheltered inlets. Landing is difficult even in favorable conditions. The climate remains cold even in the austral summer. Temperatures hover near freezing. Wind is constant. It carries moisture, salt, and fine ice particles that settle into clothing and equipment. Visibility changes quickly. Clear skies can close within minutes as fog rolls in from the ocean. Wildlife gathers along the shore: penguins, seals, and seabirds. They arrive, feed, and depart according to seasonal patterns that have remained unchanged for centuries. Their presence is temporary, dictated by instinct and migration. There are no signs of permanent human activity, no structures, no markers, no evidence that anyone has chosen to remain here. And yet, in April 1916, a group of men would reach this island under conditions they had not planned for, with no immediate means of leaving. Their arrival would not be brief. At the beginning of the 20th century, Antarctic exploration was still defined by uncertainty. Large portions of the continent remained unmapped, and travel into the Southern Ocean required both technical preparation and acceptance of extreme risk. Expeditions were rare, expensive, and dependent on limited communication with the outside world. In 1914, an Anglo-Irish explorer, Ernest Shackleton, organized a new venture known as the Imperial Transantarctic Expedition. The stated objective was direct and ambitious: to cross Antarctica from the Weddell Sea to the Ross Sea, passing through the South Pole region along the way. It was a journey of more than 1,800 miles across one of the most hostile environments on Earth. The expedition was divided into two supporting groups. One team would establish a base on the Weddell Sea side and attempt the crossing. A second group would travel to the Ross Sea to lay supply depots across the opposite side of the continent. The success of the entire plan depended on coordination between these two distant groups. The ship assigned to Shackleton's main party was the Endurance, a wooden vessel originally built for Arctic conditions. It had reinforced beams and a hull designed to withstand pressure from sea ice. Its interior was compact, with limited space for scientific equipment, provisions, and crew movement. Despite its construction, it was not immune to prolonged ice entrapment. The crew included experienced sailors, scientists, engineers, and support personnel. Many had prior experience in polar or maritime environments. Their roles were clearly defined: navigation, surveying, meteorology, biology, photography, and ship maintenance. Daily life aboard the vessel followed a structured routine of observations, mechanical upkeep, and preparation for Antarctic land travel. Shackleton himself was already known for previous polar expeditions, including a near-successful attempt to reach the South Pole in 1908. His reputation rested not on reaching geographic milestones, but on leadership under extreme conditions and the ability to preserve human life in failure. In August 1914, as the ship prepared to depart, Europe entered the First World War. Despite the changing global situation, the expedition proceeded, supported by private funding and scientific interest. The Endurance left England and began its journey southward, passing through the Atlantic and into colder latitudes. By early 1915, the ship entered the Weddell Sea. Sea ice increased steadily. Navigation became slower. The environment began to dominate operational planning. The expedition had moved beyond familiar waters. By January 1915, the Endurance had entered the deep interior of the Weddell Sea, an area known for dense and unpredictable pack ice. The sea surface was no longer open water, but a shifting mosaic of frozen plates, ridges, and pressure zones driven by wind and current. Navigation became a process of slow advancement through narrow openings that frequently closed again behind the ship. Progress was measured in short distances. Days passed without significant movement southward. The ice thickened, and the vessel began to rely on natural cracks in the pack to continue forward. Each movement required careful assessment of surrounding pressure and drift patterns. By mid-February, the ship became increasingly restricted. Ice formed along the hull and expanded outward as temperatures dropped. The surrounding pack began to close in more consistently, limiting escape routes. The crew attempted to free the vessel using saws, manual labor, and controlled pressure release, but the ice field remained dominant. On 24 February 1915, Shackleton ordered the ship to halt operations and prepare for winter drift. The Endurance was now locked in place. The ice would determine its movement, not the engine or sail. As weeks passed, the ship drifted slowly northward with the pack. This movement was not controlled. It followed the gradual shift of the ice field itself. Inside the vessel, routines continued. Scientific observations were recorded. Mechanical maintenance was performed. Meals were prepared according to strict rationing guidelines. The crew maintained structure despite the lack of external progress. Over time, the pressure of the ice increased. The hull began to respond to external force. Timber creaked under compression. The ship's structure absorbed uneven stress as surrounding ice shifted and expanded. Small fractures in the ice field sometimes released pressure temporarily, only to rebuild elsewhere. By October 1915, the situation had changed from entrapment to destruction. The Endurance was no longer simply frozen in place. It was being compressed. The ice acted as a moving mass, slowly converging on the wooden hull from all sides. On 27 October 1915, Shackleton ordered abandonment of the ship. The structural damage had become irreversible. The crew removed essential supplies and established camps on the surrounding ice. The Endurance remained behind, held upright for a short period before finally succumbing to pressure and sinking beneath the frozen surface. The expedition's original plan no longer existed. After the loss of the Endurance, the expedition shifted into an unplanned existence on the surface of the Weddell Sea ice. The crew established temporary camps directly on the pack, using salvaged materials from the ship, along with tents designed for polar travel. Wooden crates, sails, and parts of the ship's structure were repurposed to create barriers against wind and drifting snow. The ice beneath them was not stable land. It was a moving platform shaped by ocean currents and seasonal temperature changes. Large flows separated and rejoined over time, creating a landscape that constantly reconfigured itself. The men had no control over direction or speed of movement. They were carried gradually northward, away from Antarctica's interior. Daily life became defined by repetition. Watches were maintained to monitor ice conditions and detect sudden shifts or cracks in the surface. Cooking depended on limited fuel sources and stored provisions. Meals were measured carefully to extend supplies over an unknown duration. Physical activity was necessary to maintain warmth and prevent stagnation in the extreme cold. Hunting became an essential supplement to stored food. Seals were the primary source of fresh meat and fat, both critical for energy and survival in polar conditions. Penguins were also used when available. These resources were not abundant, but were sufficient to supplement rationing during the early phase of the drift. Every part of an animal was utilized to reduce waste. The crew maintained a structured routine despite uncertainty. Scientific observations continued when possible, including meteorological readings and ice movement tracking. These records provided limited insight into their position and drift direction, but offered no practical means of escape. Psychological conditions were managed through discipline rather than relief. There were no external communications and no confirmed timeline for rescue. The isolation was absolute, defined by continuous ice in all directions and the absence of visible human activity. As weeks turned into months, the ice began to fracture more frequently. Pressure ridges formed where sheets collided. Open leads of water appeared and disappeared without warning. These changes gradually increased the risk of separation between group members and loss of equipment. By early 1916, the stability of the ice floes had weakened further. The structure that had supported their camp was no longer reliable for long-term occupation. The surface beneath them was breaking apart more regularly, signaling the approach of open sea conditions. It became clear that remaining on the ice was no longer a sustainable option. By April 1916, the ice surrounding the expedition had changed from a continuous platform into a fractured field of unstable floes. Open water channels widened between slabs of drifting ice, and the structural integrity of their temporary camps could no longer be maintained. Shackleton made the decision to abandon the ice entirely. 3 lifeboats were prepared for launch: the James Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancomb Wills. Originally carried aboard the Endurance as auxiliary craft, they were now the only means of reaching land. The boats were reinforced as much as possible using salvaged wood, canvas, and improvised sealing materials to reduce the risk of flooding in heavy seas. The crew loaded supplies carefully. Provisions included preserved food, seal meat, navigation tools, and minimal fuel. Weight had to be balanced against seaworthiness. Every item placed aboard was evaluated for necessity. Excess could compromise survival in rough ocean conditions. The destination was not fully certain. Elephant Island was selected as the nearest viable landmass, approximately 100 miles away, though distances in Antarctic waters were difficult to calculate precisely due to shifting ice and currents. On the 9th of April, 1916, the boats were launched into the open sea. The transition from ice to water was immediate and severe. The Southern Ocean presented long swells, driven by wind systems, unbroken by land. The vessels, small and heavily loaded, moved through unstable wave patterns that required constant correction. Navigation relied on basic instruments and visual tracking of sun position and landmarks when visible. Progress was slow and dependent on weather conditions. At times, ice fields forced the boats to detour or wait in exposed water until passages opened. Conditions aboard the boats were physically demanding. Cold exposure remained constant due to wind and spray. Wet clothing increased risk of hypothermia. Rest was limited and fragmented, as crew members alternated between rowing, steering, and bailing water. Separation risk was significant. The 3 boats operated in proximity, but were vulnerable to drifting apart in fog or heavy seas. Communication depended on visual signals and intermittent shouting across waves. Over several days, the weather fluctuated between relative calm and severe storms. Ice fragments and swell patterns made progress unpredictable. Fatigue accumulated steadily among the crew, but movement toward land continued without interruption. After days at sea, a dark silhouette appeared on the horizon. It was Elephant Island. Elephant Island appeared as a low, dark outline against a pale and shifting sky. From the sea, it offered no clear harbor or sheltered approach. Its coastline was steep in places, broken in others, shaped by constant wave impact and glacial erosion. The surrounding waters remained active with swell and drifting ice. The boats approached cautiously. Landing required identifying a section of shore where surf conditions were momentarily manageable. Even then, waves could shift suddenly, pushing vessels back or striking them against submerged rock. The operation required timing rather than precision. After extended effort, the expedition made landfall on a narrow, exposed beach along the island's western edge. The terrain immediately beyond the shoreline rose into uneven rock and snow-covered slopes. There were no natural flat areas suitable for permanent settlement. The men and boats were brought ashore in stages. Equipment and provisions were carried through surf zones under constant risk of injury or loss. Once on land, the boats were hauled above the tide line and partially inverted to serve as emergency shelters. This arrangement formed the basis of a temporary camp. Canvas and wooden supports were used to close gaps beneath the overturned hulls. The shelters were low and cramped, designed for survival rather than comfort. Snow and wind frequently entered through openings that could not be fully sealed. The environment remained unstable. Wind patterns shifted rapidly along the coast, bringing cold air from the interior and moisture from the sea. Visibility often dropped due to fog and blowing snow. The ground beneath the camp remained damp and uneven, complicating movement and rest. There were no signs of external human presence. No established supply routes, no expectation of immediate rescue. The island's location placed it far outside regular shipping lanes, making accidental discovery unlikely. Despite these conditions, the group maintained basic organization. Tasks were assigned for shelter maintenance, food preparation, and equipment preservation. Hunting continued when possible, though available wildlife was limited compared to earlier stages on the ice. It became increasingly clear that Elephant Island was not a destination, but a holding point. The question of departure remained unresolved. Shackleton began evaluating options beyond the island itself. By the time Elephant Island had become a functioning but fragile base, the conditions of survival had stabilized only in the narrowest sense. The men had shelter beneath the overturned boats, limited supplies, and a coastline that provided occasional access to seals and penguins. However, the island remained isolated from any known shipping routes. No rescue could be expected without deliberate action. Shackleton assessed the situation in terms of probability rather than hope. The nearest inhabited land was South Georgia, a whaling station located more than 800 nautical miles away across the Southern Ocean. The distance was far beyond what the expedition's remaining lifeboats were designed to handle, especially under Antarctic conditions. Despite this, one of the boats, the James Caird, was selected for modification into a long-distance open-sea vessel. Its hull was strengthened using timber salvaged from the other boats and reinforced with additional beams. The structure was further covered with canvas and sealed to reduce water ingress. The objective was to improve its ability to survive sustained exposure to heavy seas. A small crew was chosen for the voyage. Shackleton was joined by 5 men selected for seamanship and endurance. Their departure required careful redistribution of remaining supplies among those staying behind. The intention was not abandonment, but separation of effort. One group would attempt rescue, while the other remained in place. Weather conditions at the time of departure were briefly favorable, with reduced wind and manageable swell. Even so, the Southern Ocean remained unpredictable. The route to South Georgia required navigation across some of the most unstable waters in the world, with limited instruments and no guarantee of positional accuracy. On the day of departure, the James Caird was launched from the beach and moved beyond the surf zone. There was no formal ceremony or extended farewell. The separation occurred as a logistical necessity rather than an emotional event. Once at sea, the remaining crew on Elephant Island returned to their shelters. Leadership passed to Frank Wild, who assumed responsibility for maintaining order, rationing supplies, and preserving morale. Their survival now depended entirely on the success of a voyage that was already beyond standard maritime risk. The island remained unchanged. The sea continued its cycles, and the camp entered a period of waiting without certainty of return. After the departure of the James Caird, the remaining men on Elephant Island were reduced to a static survival condition. Their camp, constructed from the overturned lifeboats, remained the only structured shelter on the exposed shoreline. The sound of the ocean dominated the environment, breaking against rock and ice with consistent force. Frank Wild assumed command of the group. His role was administrative rather than strategic, focused on maintaining routine under conditions that offered no external change. Tasks were divided to preserve order: cooking, maintenance of shelter, monitoring of weather, and periodic hunting expeditions along the coast. Food supplies were limited but carefully managed. Seal and penguin meat remained the primary source of nutrition. Consumption was rationed to extend availability over an unknown duration. There was no reliable way to estimate how long Shackleton's party might take to reach South Georgia or return with assistance. The physical environment placed constant strain on daily operations. Wind conditions shifted without warning, sometimes forcing the men to remain inside the overturned boats for extended periods. Snow accumulation required frequent clearing to prevent structural collapse or blockage of entrances. Time became increasingly difficult to measure in meaningful terms. Without external signals or variation in activity, the passage of days blended into a continuous cycle of maintenance and survival. Scientific observation was no longer a priority. Survival tasks dominated all available effort. Psychological pressure increased gradually rather than through isolated events. The absence of communication from Shackleton's party introduced uncertainty that could not be resolved through calculation or observation. Every interpretation of delay remained speculative. Despite these conditions, discipline remained consistent. The group maintained structured routines for cooking, sleeping, and equipment care. This structure functioned as a stabilizing mechanism, preventing further breakdown of operational capacity. Health conditions began to reflect prolonged exposure. Cold-related injuries, fatigue, and nutritional limitations accumulated over time. Recovery was slow due to environmental constraints and limited medical resources. Outside the camp, Elephant Island remained unchanged. Ice movement along the shoreline continued, and weather systems passed without regard to human presence. There were no signs of external observation or rescue attempts. The situation was defined by waiting, not anticipation, but suspension. In the months following Shackleton's departure, conditions on Elephant Island remained largely unchanged. The men continued their routines under Frank Wild's leadership, maintaining shelter and rationing supplies while monitoring the sea for any sign of distant movement. There was no reliable way to determine the progress of the rescue voyage. Unbeknown to them, Shackleton's journey had succeeded against extreme navigational and environmental constraints. The James Caird had reached South Georgia after a demanding crossing of the Southern Ocean. From there, Shackleton organized repeated rescue attempts, each one delayed by weather, ice conditions, or logistical limitations in available vessels. Several failed approaches to Elephant Island were made using ships unable to penetrate the surrounding pack ice. The island's position and seasonal ice conditions made direct access difficult, even for reinforced vessels. Time continued to pass without contact. Eventually, assistance was secured through Chilean maritime support. The tug vessel Yelcho, under the command of Captain Luis Pardo, was selected for a final attempt due to its relatively strong engine and suitable hull design for icy waters. On 30 August 1916, the Yelcho approached Elephant Island. Unlike previous attempts, it succeeded in navigating through the surrounding ice without being forced to retreat. The coastline came into view, and the camp established beneath the overturned boats was located. There was no immediate awareness from the shore party. The men were inside their shelters when the ship arrived. Once identified, coordination for evacuation began quickly. Conditions still required careful transfer of personnel and equipment through surf and unstable shoreline. All remaining members of the Elephant Island party were successfully evacuated. No lives had been lost during the entire period of isolation on the island. The departure was orderly and direct. The camp was abandoned without reconstruction or removal of structures, leaving only the overturned boats and minimal remains of occupation. Elephant Island returned to its prior state of uninhabited isolation. The survival of Shackleton's crew on Elephant Island became part of a broader history of Antarctic exploration that had already been defined by uncertainty, limited technology, and extreme environmental constraint. Their experience was not marked by conquest of the landscape, but by prolonged exposure to conditions that resisted control or prediction. Elephant Island itself remained unchanged by their presence. Its coastline, shaped by wind and ice, continued its natural cycle of erosion and seasonal variation. The temporary structures left behind were gradually reclaimed by snow, wind, and salt exposure. No permanent trace of the camp remained in any functional sense. The expedition's outcome is often recorded in terms of survival without loss of life during the Elephant Island phase, and the successful rescue after extended isolation. However, the broader significance lies in the operational decisions that shaped each stage of the journey. The abandonment of the Endurance, the management of drifting ice conditions, the coordination of open boat navigation, and the disciplined maintenance of structure during prolonged waiting. Shackleton's role is frequently examined within historical accounts of leadership under extreme conditions. His decisions were shaped by immediate environmental realities rather than long-term planning, and by the necessity of maintaining group cohesion in situations where uncertain assistance was uncertain or delayed. The men who remained on Elephant Island demonstrated sustained operational discipline in an environment that offered no strategic advantage. Their survival depended on routine, resource management, and controlled adaptation to a static but hostile setting. In the wider context of Antarctic exploration, the expedition represents a transition point between early exploratory risk-taking and more structured scientific and logistical approaches that would develop later in the 20th century. Elephant Island continues to exist at the edge of the Southern Ocean, largely unvisited and unchanged. It remains a place defined not by human presence, but by its absence. The story concludes without transformation of the landscape, only the temporary passage of those who endured it.